that introduction. So a little bit more about me. I've spent the last 20 years working in the field of cybersecurity. I spent most of my life developing a very specific skill from a very early age, which is hacking into computer systems. And what that usually entails is looking through bits and pieces of programming code, finding mistakes that developers have introduced into their code, and finding ways of manipulating those situations to make computers do something that it was just never intended to accomplish. And that's largely what hacking is all about. Later on in life, I found out that this unique skill that I had developed was in need both in the corporate world and government. So I have spent a great deal of time working at organizations like the Communications Security Establishment, sort of the NSA organization for Canada that protects our nation's critical infrastructure, and also working for police organizations on forensic cases. I got involved in doing a lot of forensic analysis work, both in the corporate sector and in the public sector. As Meta had mentioned as well, I'm also the membership director of the Toronto chapter of the World Federalist Movement. So everything geopolitics and security studies, international studies is a field of keen interest of mine. And I've spent a great deal of time deeply considering these topics and how the world that we have today as a more connected society is become quite dependent and reliant on people to ensure that these systems that we use and rely upon are functioning on a day-to-day basis, are available, and are safe and secure for our use. Certainly we've had examples in the past 5 to 10 years of devastating hacking incidents perpetrated by criminal organizations, mostly with a profit motivation to steal information and data that can be resold. But a phenomenon that we've recently witnessed is the full-scale move towards cyber warfare by nation states. And I think as a peace organization, in order to understand how to work towards a more sustained peace, especially in a future where cyber warfare becomes much more of a reality, I think it's important for organizations such as yourself to understand a little bit about war fighting. If you don't know the tools and the tactics that nation states would use to cause devastating damage in the context of cyber war, then you don't really understand how you could work towards mitigating the effects of this kind of activity in civil society. And certainly I'll talk a little bit about how cyber warfare impacts a civil society and what are some of the implications of cyber warfare in that context. So we'll start off by introducing a term that some of you may or may not be familiar with, which is called the fifth domain. From a war-fighting strategy, if you are in the military, there's certainly different dimensions of warfare that are often discussed. The terms land, sea, air, and space come to mind when we talk about domains in which the military operates. One of the recent additions to that term is a fifth dimension of warfare, which is often referred to as cyberspace. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of how this idea of war fighting in the fifth domain came about. But a couple of key developments that I should probably mention straight off the bat is the recent developments in the US, partially as a result of the Obama administration, which had paved the way for the United States to develop what's called the US Cyber Command. US Cyber Command is an organization that is tasked with defending America's interests in cyberspace. And so up on the slide in May 2009, President Obama had essentially made some public declarations and pronouncements that cyberspace and America's digital infrastructure is a national asset that needs to be protected. 1 month later, the Pentagon and the NSA had developed the US Cyber Command, running under the auspices of the NSA at that point in time. And the years since 2009 has been interesting because we see many other nation states around the world also developing their own centralized structures to develop these sort of cyber operations capabilities. So as a result of the United States' recent maneuvers in cyberspace, we see that every other nation state is taking a cue from the US and deciding, yes, we need to develop these capabilities as well. We need a warfighting capability in cyberspace, and we need to develop our own sort of, cyber command type organization and structure. Most recently, some developments with US Cyber Command that has happened pretty much under the nose of the public, which is President Trump has elevated the status of the US Cyber Command to a full combatant command. So what that does is very much declare that the mandate of US Cyber Command is very much in the realm of warfighting. Certainly, there are organizations in the past that have been tasked with cybersecurity, like the NSA. The NSA, fundamentally at its core, has a defensive mandate. They also have maintained some semblance of a warfighting capability within the realm of cyber. But the development of a separate command, separate and apart from the NSA, is a very strong indication that the United States believes that the realm of cyberspace is something that they need to be able to have capabilities to address and to dominate. So if anybody had any illusions as to what the US Cyber Command is, it is fundamentally a warfighting organization. So what is the fifth domain? The first time that this term sort of appeared in the public lexicon was in 1995, when General Fogelman, who was in charge of the US Air Force at the time as Chief of Staff, introduced this topic. And I'll just try to read that middle phrase, because I think it's quite important to listen to the words of General Fogelman. This information explosion signals that we're crossing a new frontier. Information has an ascending and transcending influence for our society and our military forces. As such, I think it is appropriate to call information operations the fifth domain of warfare. So this is one of the first times that we can see an individual who has been involved in what was previously called information operations, declaring that this new realm called cyberspace should and ought to be regarded as a fifth dimension of warfare. A little bit more about the history of this idea of the fifth domain can be found in the US military's dictionary and lexicon of terms. And in it, it says, the integrated employment of the core capabilities of electronic warfare, computer network operations, psychological operations, military deception, and operational security in concert with specified supporting and related capabilities to influence, disrupt, corrupt, or usurp adversarially human and automated decision-making while protecting our own. So the reason why I put that up there is because this is probably a definition of cyber warfare that most people don't quite have a concept of. Cyber warfare is much more all-encompassing than just simply breaking into computer systems. The objective of cyber warfare is to interfere with command and control operations, political control over the military, over military capabilities fundamentally, and interference in the decision-making processes of both civilian and military governments at the end of the day, or leadership. So in that context, there's a whole lot involved in cyber warfare than just simply the technical hackers behind the scenes breaking into code. We've seen some examples of that later in the presentation. I'll go through 3 specific examples of the cyber warfare type activities that have actually been reported in the press. What I want you to take away from this is that cyber warfare is something that is much, much larger than the technical nature that the word and the name necessarily alludes to. So that then begs the question, well, what is cyberspace? If the fifth domain refers to warfighting in cyberspace, then what is cyberspace? The term cyber is probably the first time it was used was in a series of novels written by William Gibson, who wrote a series of what was called cyberpunk fiction novels. And in it, he had a very specific use to the term cyberspace. And cyberspace was the environment, a virtual reality type environment that he referred to as a sort of communal hallucination of what it would be like to plug in your consciousness into a networked world of computer systems and their respective users. So that was what cyberspace was to William Gibson. To me, my definition is in the second column, which is cyberspace is the technological substratum that essentially underpins our modern information society and civilization. More and more today, everything that we rely upon, right down to our cars, soon to be our refrigerators, potentially even our dogs, if you've ever seen a Japanese Aibo, relies upon the internet. And probably one of the most sad and sorry events is the owner of an Aibo not upgrading the critical firmware and having to bury their electronic dog. I mean, I saw some YouTube videos where people are actually giving funerals to their little Aibos. So this is just underscoring how much technology has really influenced the very essence of our being. And I think at some point in the future, we'll see very much the convergence of our being with technology. And I think we will see people eventually living in a virtual reality environment that'll be so surreal and so visceral, especially when we have technology that can then plug into the very brain that produces our sort of consensus reality. I think we'll have a very interesting future ahead of ourselves when individuals choose to live their lives out in this virtual reality that we sort of allude to as cyberspace. So it's really become, in a very short amount of time, just an essential aspect of all life. All of the systems that we've built for ourselves in civilization, whether those are systems to govern, to manage, to organize, to build, to design, to educate, to inform, all of it relies upon connectivity to this thing that we call cyberspace. So it's definitely the single most pervasive technology that I think we've ever developed. And as a result of that, our reliance upon it means that the bad guys can also exploit our use of technology and our use and reliance upon this thing that we call cyberspace to their advantage and to our detriment. And certainly in the context of a modern democracy, where individuals are now heavily informed by things that we call social media, the opportunity to exploit, to subvert is done at an industrial scale today that I think few people have the opportunity to fathom. So here's a quote from one of William Gibson's books called The Neuromancer. "The Matrix is a world within the world, a global consensus hallucination, the representation of every byte of data in cyberspace." So that was William Gibson's view of what the future could be like. And I think we are definitely hurtling ourselves towards that sort of future that was alluded to in Neuromancer. So back to the fifth domain. If we are to understand how governments are trying to co-opt this thing that we call cyberspace in order to wage conflict and war, I think it's really important to sort of understand some principles of war fighting in cyberspace. Most of my background in cybersecurity has actually been spent in a military context. So a lot of what I spent my time and my career doing is actually developing war fighting capabilities, developing code that can break into computer systems, developing surveillance tools and technologies, and really having built a framework and a principle for how governments should necessarily engage in this kind of activity. So I'll share some 3 fundamental points that I've sort of coalesced this thinking around into 3 fundamental areas that I think every government who hopes to engage in this warfighting capability needs to think about and develop. And certainly for you, it'll provide some keen insights into what we really mean when we say cyber warfare. So the first principle in warfighting in the fifth domain is global situational awareness. We'll talk a little bit in the next slide about what that encompasses, but if you are to engage in this fifth domain, you need to have a keen understanding of what's going on in that realm at any given point in time. So having access to technologies that can provide you that level of visibility is keen and critical in preparing any sort of battle plan for warfighting in this area of the fifth domain. Number 2, freedom of action. In order to engage in cyber operations, you need to have the capability to conduct cyber operations capably in this domain. You need to be able to have an adept skill set that will allow you to conduct whatever activities are necessary at any given point in time for the success of that mission or for whatever effects you're trying to achieve from it. And there are some very specific skills that need to be developed in order to acquire this sort of quality of freedom of action. And number 3, the third key principle of developing warfighting capability is probably the one area that is least understood and the one area that does not have enough visibility and is not really given enough credit in the realm of cyber warfare, which is the development of influence and dissuasion capabilities. So going back to global situational awareness. So what I mean by that is the development of 3 capability areas: intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So in a traditional military context, this means sending out scouts ahead of a battle to sort of prep the battlefield with intelligence information. In cyberspace, that's a little bit different. What that encompasses is gathering technical data and information about systems on the internet, who they're communicating with, how they're structured, what operating systems are they running, what versions of patches are they running on their system. All of this information is detailed and necessary intelligence for an organization that is tasked with a warfighting capability. If you don't understand where your potential targets are and what sort of tools and technologies that they're deploying, or if you're trying to size up your adversary and you don't understand anything about the techniques that they might be deploying against you, then you're really going to be fighting quite blind. So part of cyber warfare, and a very important and integral part, is gathering necessary intelligence about your adversary's technical capabilities, skills, techniques, methods, and practices. Second, surveillance. Surveillance is usually thought of as a bad word, but I mean there are nation states and criminal actors out there that are doing very bad things, and they're causing an incredible amount of harm to individuals in society and society at large. So governments do need some capacity to develop surveillance technologies, and especially with the internet today. As we have technologies like your Apple iPhone, which has advanced encryption, posing great difficulty to law enforcement whenever they're trying to get access to a criminal who's been using a particular iPhone, the way that organizations like police organizations get around that is developing surveillance technologies. So as much as we have privacy technologies that protect us, these privacy technologies has sort of escalated basically escalated the developments of cyber weapons, because at the end of the day, if the adversary can protect their information to the extent that a government cannot understand what they're communicating about and preempt or prevent future attacks in the context of a criminal organization, they have to be able to get around that some way. And the one way to get around that is developing better surveillance tools and technologies. And that's exactly what we've seen. As there are more and more privacy tools and technologies available to the public, there's an escalation in the availability of surveillance tools and technologies for government use as well as public use. I mean, you can now go on the internet and pay $80 and download fairly sophisticated surveillance technology to spy on your loved ones, your ex-wife, a spouse, a girlfriend. And this is also a dimension and a consequence of developing a cyber warfare capability. As nations move towards this, you have all this kind of stuff leaking into civil society, being used in ways that was never really intended. But that's a consequence of the development of that kind of technology. And reconnaissance, of course, so being able to actually get out there and spy on positions, gain access to camera footage, for instance, hacking into a criminal organization's laptops so you can surveil them at any given point in time, understand where they are, gather some information about their environment, where they operate, et cetera, et cetera. So those are three capabilities that fit into this development of situational awareness in cyberspace. So number two, freedom of action. In order to acquire this quality of freedom of action, a nation state needs to develop three core capabilities. Number one, they need to have very good defensive cyber capabilities. If you're about to go out there and perform offensive activities, you better be able and quite capable to defend yourself at home, because going out there into the world with this offensive stance is going to bring about retaliation. And retaliation in cyberspace has been democratized. It's relatively inexpensive for very small nation states that don't necessarily have the budgets that the United States would have, or the budgets that even our own country would have, to be able to affect some pretty devastating changes in society using brain power. The power and skill of an individual hacker and a group of hackers that are trained to exploit vulnerabilities in code is a great equalizer in the world today. It also poses a significant threat to larger established nation states that are used to fighting a war with a huge advantage. I mean, the advantage of resources, money, energy. Now we have states like North Korea that have very quickly, in a very short amount of time, with very few resources, developed a fairly rudimentary but capable cyber warfare fighting force. And I think it's safe to say that a North Korea with advanced cyber weapons is certainly a North Korea that we don't want to contend with in the world. It certainly complicates everything from diplomatic efforts, efforts in the realm of foreign affairs as well as military operations. So at the end of the day, developing defensive cyber capabilities is a key and critical area for any country let alone any military today. Number two, when bad things happen, you also need to have a response capability that's adept enough to be able to address the situation at hand. This is also an area that I think is overlooked in the corporate world as well. You know, a lot of organizations spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on purchasing defensive technologies to defend against a cyber attack. But it's inevitable that they will get breached at some point or another. And when an organization is breached, few organizations necessarily have the capability to respond to that breach, to mitigate the effects of the breach, to stop private information from leaking out or customer information. This is the one area that I think corporations and governments alike need to be very aware of. And the third area in developing warfighting capability so that you can acquire this quality freedom action is, of course, the offensive cyber capabilities. So that can mean breaking into individual computer systems, but it also means being free and capable to deal with any kind of technology that you might encounter. So that could mean a printer at home. That could mean a television screen. If North Korea has a LG television screen up in a critical area that is connected to a network, then the United States has a vested interest in trying to figure out, well, how could they exploit that television in order to get into that environment to then plant surveillance technology to capably defend against a North Korean cyber attack in the future. And that's what offensive cyber capabilities mean. But what offensive cyber capabilities also means is developing a platform from which to launch industrial scale attacks against your enemy. And in order to do that, you need to be able to exploit computer systems that are far outside of the realm of your military environment. You need to compromise hundreds, if not thousands, of systems that you can co-opt into a large-scale cyber attack. What that necessarily means is that any nation state that is developing cyber warfare capability is developing a framework to break into any and every computer system they can find on the internet. So that means the computer system that runs the purchasing kiosk at an airport terminal is just as much vulnerable to being co-opted as a part of a cyber warfare campaign as your computer system at home, or the computer system that your corner store runs in order to run the sales terminals. In this day and age, nobody should have the mindset that, I'm not an important person. Why do I need to carry? Why do I need to be concerned about cybersecurity? It's not as if I'm some spy or nation state that anybody wants to break into me. Well, the reason why we have to care and why we have to care as a nation is because in order for a foreign adversary to be able to capably launch massive attacks against us, they're going to have to, at some point, co-opt our civilian infrastructure to do so. And that's why everybody should care. And that's why every nation state needs to be concerned about this. But our country, in trying to defend against this kind of activity, who needs to develop a warfighting capability, also needs to develop capable offensive capabilities to be able to launch a retaliatory attack in the event that our systems are breached. That's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate but dark reality. But here in this country, I think we need to pay much more closer attention to developing these sort of dark side capabilities, if anything, as a deterrence mechanism. If those who would seek to disrupt our society sees that we have a capable method of responding to a large-scale attack, then they might take a second look and determine whether that's an avenue that they necessarily want to follow through with. But But if they don't see any capable retaliatory capability to strike back in the event that a foreign nation state disrupts our electrical systems, then it's an avenue that they would seriously pursue. And they can do that with relative ease, and they can do that with relative anonymity, and with a relatively low budget in comparison to a traditional arsenal. So now we come to the influence and dissuasion capability. Any nation state that wants to develop a capable warfighting capability in the fifth domain must become highly adept at influence operations and that deterrence kind of mechanism. So I talked to you about dissuasion in the context of developing offensive capabilities makes us a harder target. That's one form of dissuasion, but that can take that could be in many different forms. When we're talking about influence operations, what we're fundamentally talking about is being able to affect changes in perception, attitude, and/or opinion. So if, for instance, there's an individual who's tasked with maintaining some sort of warfighting capability in a foreign nation state, and we, in defending attacks from that nation state, can somehow change that person's perception about what he's faced with, what's the level of threat that he necessarily is contending with. If we can somehow shift his attitude or perspective about what he's doing, or change his opinions about what's the right course of action for that nation state to follow, then this is essentially a useful skill in our back pocket. And much of what we've seen out of cyber warfare today falls into this realm. I mean, we haven't seen such massive, large-scale cyber warfare attacks against critical infrastructure, but what we have seen is massive influence operations to change society's perceptions, attitudes, and opinions on a whole wide variety of different matters that conflict with the foreign policy objectives of our adversaries. Deception capabilities. So in addition to developing influence capabilities, we also need to be able to develop deception capability to engage in warfighting. And what that specifically means is fabrication, manipulation, or the co-option of networks, computer systems, data, information, if you will. So any nation state that is developing a warfighting capability is also developing a capability to manipulate data, change data, fake data in one way, shape, or form, but also co-opt systems, individuals, organizations, to be able to affect the changes desired at the end of the day. And lastly, the other area that's not often considered when we think of cyber warfare is the development of economic warfare capabilities. Much of the global economy also relies upon the use of technology, and developing economic warfare capabilities in an environment where you have high-frequency trading systems that largely are responsible for much of the trade that we see on public markets, means being able to develop tools and technologies to manipulate, control those high-frequency trading systems, to develop better technology to engage in high-frequency trading, as an example. So that's just a little-known area that also is part and parcel. But economic warfare also means disrupting a nation-state's ability to acquire the materials that they need in order to develop high technology. Being able to somehow inhibit an organization or a nation-state's ability to acquire different kinds of magnets and rare earth metals, for instance, would fall into this realm of economic warfare, and would still find itself in the realm of cyber warfighting, because if you don't have the rare earth metals to develop the cool, nifty technologies that you rely upon, then you can't develop a capability to surpass the offensive capabilities of your adversary. And similar to us, I mean, we have here in Canada, other nation states have attempted to engage in economic warfare against us. One example of this is I've done a lot of work in the metals and mining sector in defending cyber attacks on behalf of Canada's resources sector. And in one such case that I had been responding to an attack, there was a message left behind on the system that has some very, very specific information in it that only about a handful of people would have really known what it necessarily means. But what it had to do with is really a foreign policy dispute that our country was having with another nation state. And this was a message pointing to that issue behind closed doors as the reason for this retaliatory strike against an organization here in Canada. And that is not the first time that I have responded to cyber attacks as a cybersecurity professional where similar messages have been left behind. Part of the influence operation that's part of cyber warfare fighting is also manipulating your feelings about how capable you are in defending against sophisticated attacks. And if a foreign nation state can make our nation state feel defenseless, then that might affect and influence the way that we make decisions for ourselves in defending against those nations' attacks. And this is very much the reality of what cyber warfare looks like today. So the message I want to get across by sharing this information is that cyber warfare is unconventional, asymmetric, irregular warfare. Much of the infrastructure that we rely upon that is part of cyberspace is civilian infrastructure. So in order to engage in cyber warfare, you need to also be able to engage, manipulate, and control that civilian infrastructure to do your bidding. It may also mean that you need to, at some point, co-opt individuals that are at the helm of those systems to be able to maintain them, make sure that they remain available for operation. It also means that civilians play, to an extent, a role in developing a cyber warfare capability from the perspective of developing defensive capabilities. The United States is actually one of the first nations that has gone to the extent of saying, well, we think that civilians in some capacity should be able to defend themselves against cyber attacks, especially when we're dealing with a situation where corporations are the ones managing our nation's critical infrastructure. So I'm just going to read this segment from a bill that was introduced at the US House that speaks to this. It is the purpose of this act to provide legal certainty by clarifying the type of tools and techniques that defenders can use that exceed the boundaries of their own computer networks. What we're talking about here is civilians being able to hack into a computer system that they don't own, that they perceive as somehow threatening the safety and the security of their own networks. So, if everything that I've described about cyber warfighting hasn't alluded to the fact that it's incredibly difficult for you to track back and pinpoint the origin of an attack or attribute an attack to any one specific adversary, let me just say this very clearly. It is possible to attribute attacks to foreign nation states, but it is an incredibly difficult job that requires a massive amount of resources and money. and a long amount of time at your disposal to be able to attribute cyber attacks to any one particular nation state. So the idea that a critical infrastructure company should develop a hacking capability to go out and break into computer systems is scary, because that could be perceived as an act of war. So if we are fully engaged in warfighting in the fifth domain, we have to understand that civilians play a role in that, and what civilians do have wide-reaching ramifications. But this is definitely something that that I think we, as the public and the citizenry, should be aware of as we march forward into this new brave world, where even civilians are going to be engaging in cyber warfare capabilities on behalf of their governments. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in particular. So I have 3 examples of how all of this stuff sort of comes to be and what it looks like from our perspective. What does cyber warfare really look like? One example is this. This is a building in St. Petersburg that is attributed to the Russian Internet Research Agency. This is what's called a governmental building in Russia. There's lots of different buildings in Russia that are deemed governmental buildings and are protected. There's guards at the door, and it's very difficult to enter, and all the windows are covered, and you can't quite see in through the opaque glass. These are organizations that play some role in official matters, and certainly this Internet Research Agency is one such organization that is based out of a building that is deemed to be one of these governmental buildings. One of the things that this building was responsible for is developing a framework to create, hundreds, if not thousands, of profiles on the internet, social media profiles from Twitter to LinkedIn to Facebook to Instagram, and sharing very divisive political propaganda and literature. Facebook, in their recent investigations into alleged activities by Russia to interfere in the US election, have actually been able to attribute a fairly substantial amount of ad campaign activity to this one organization. One of the things that they had noted, however, is that the information that they were sharing was really divisive political propaganda from across the ideological spectrum. So what that tells us is that Russia may not have had a specific objective in mind or effect in mind, number one, potentially. Number two, the activity of this organization had been occurring long before the US election and will continue to occur long after the US election. And different countries around the world have been tracking these kinds of troll factories, if you will, that are out there pumping out divisive themes. And the reason why they do that is because it somehow serves their national interest at the end of the day. If it did not serve a nation state's national interest to engage in such activities, then they would not spend the massive amounts of money that they do on developing infrastructure to engage in these sort of deception campaigns. So here's another example of what cyber warfare looks like. Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a worm that had been seemingly designed with the objective of breaking into centrifuges, nuclear centrifuges, specifically in Iran, within their Natanz nuclear facility. So this is a piece of code that affected the industrial control systems of a centrifuge that was intended to actually cause a physical effect. And the effect was to cause an explosion in those centrifuges, and largely with the objective of delaying Iran's development of nuclear capabilities. So here's probably the world's first example of a public cyber weapon having been used against a foreign nation state. Now, we don't know which nation state launched this attack, and it's still quite difficult to attribute this back, but in the popular press, this is commonly attributed back to a US and Israeli operation. And certainly there have been comments coming out of US and Israeli military personnel that seem to allude to the fact that, yes, maybe it was a cyber weapon that they had developed, but we'll never really know, because if it's in a nation state's interest to say or to suggest that, yes, we do have these capabilities and we were the ones that were able to accomplish that, that certainly fits into the realm of influence operations and part of a deterrence campaign. So we don't really know. But what we do know for certain is that the resources required in order to design and develop the cyber weapon would have had to be quite significant. There's a big difference between developing an exploit that can take advantage of a computer bug and turning that into an operational tool that can be relied upon to engage in warfare activities. And as much as Hollywood likes to portray this sort of cyber warfare activity as in the domain of singular hackers working in their basements, developing cool, nifty tools and technology that they then engage in, cyber warfare capabilities, it's not really the way it is. It requires a lot of money and a lot of people and a lot of brain power and a lot of time to develop a weapon of war. And this certainly was a weapon of war. By today's standards, Stuxnet is actually not that impressive anymore. But at the time, it was seemingly state of the art, and it would have cost an immense amount of money, and it would have used hundreds of people to develop that technology. And not only that, the technology was deployed in an environment that was considered a very hard target. Certainly it was well protected. There's guys with guns at every single door. There's a lot of sophisticated surveillance technology and physical security technology. This is not the kind of facility that you can just waltz on in and drop a couple of USB sticks with a virus on it and expect that somebody's going to pick it up and put it into a computer. Although some people have alluded to the fact that that's maybe what happened in a super secure area of the Natanz facility, and somebody picked it up and plugged it in, and it caused havoc. But to be able to get that level of access would have required a joint operation with intelligence professionals, intelligence operatives, military personnel. So we do know that this was a nation-state-sponsored cyber weapon, despite the fact that we don't know necessarily who had deployed it. But the interesting consequence to that is there were variants of this Stuxnet virus that were found in industrial control systems far outside of Iran that was using the exact same code base. And in investigating some of those samples, we found out that the time at which those samples had been compiled sometimes stretches 10 years in the past. So this Stuxnet program was a weapon that had been designed probably in the late 90s, or maybe even mid to late 90s, and had been developed and maintained and used on operations for almost 10, 15 years before anybody even found it. So that is the scope and the scale of the kinds of offensive cyber warfare activities that we're faced with today. That you can have a weapon that was designed to run for 15 years without being detected. It's pretty incredible to imagine. And third example of what cyber warfare is like. There's an organization called the Cutting Sword of Justice. And this was a group that allied themselves with Iran and had seemingly operates as if they are a hacking group making big pronouncements. We're going to hack into this and hack into that and what have you. This sort of group had been responsible for developing a piece of malware that had affected industrial control systems at Saudi Aramco, and had caused some significant damage to operations at Saudi Aramco. So it is interesting that here's a hacking group that's sort of looks like a group that might be a bunch of civilians that are protesting maybe Saudi U.S. actions, but it just so happens that taking out Saudi Aramco does serve the national interest of Iran, that is involved in a proxy war with Saudi Arabia across the entire region. So what's really going on here is Iran has taken a number of different means and methods in developing cyber warfare capability. Number one, their hackers look almost indistinguishable from civilian hacking groups. Number two, hacking groups like Anonymous have also been co-opted in order to undertake cyber attacks against interesting infrastructure. And one cool story that I have is I'd been called in to respond to a cyber attack in a Toronto-based internet service provider. It was a hosting company. And when I investigated, I found a really interesting, very specific tool set that was deployed on that server to conduct what's called denial of service attacks against other systems, where you overwhelm the other system with data and information, and it causes those systems to crash. When I investigated this tool, I was able to find out that this is actually a very specific tool that was used on a number of different hacking campaigns that were attributed to Anonymous. However, the interesting part to this was I found a file that had a number of targets around the world that were used as a part of a distributed denial of service campaign from that computer system. And those targets were very, very specific targets. When you started to look into it and tried to collect some intelligence on where are these targets, these were targets of government computer systems the world over. They all fit a general pattern. It all served the interests of one particular party. But these were not systems that you would just so happen to find browsing on the internet occasionally or casually. It was a very highly cultivated target list. When we investigated further, we found out that the individuals that were running these attacks were not some super secret government agency. It was a bunch of teenage hackers that grouped themselves under the Anonymous flag and banner, and went to town with their distributed denial of service attacks. But what was curious is that the tools were given to them by a third party, and the targets were also given to them by a third party. And it's really interesting to sort of understand that even organizations that seemingly have no connection to cyber warfare or foreign governments, and maybe they're activist organizations and groups that are fighting the good fight, so to speak, are being co-opted by nation states in order to launch cyber attacks in a completely anonymous fashion. So they were essentially the cutout type group that was chosen by this particular adversary to conduct cyber attacks against these specific government targets. Iran has been very notorious in co-opting civilian hacking groups. In Iran, there have been hackers that have been caught as teenagers just joyriding across the internet just for fun. They're thrown in jail, given the experience of what an Iranian jail looks like, and then approached and asked, so, how would you like to hack for us? And you'll get out of jail free, and you won't have to do, next 3 to 5 years of hard time. Why don't you fight the good fight with Iran, and we'll cut you a deal. And this is the kind of activity that's happening not just simply in Iran, but the world over. But Iran has been particularly keen on co-opting civilians to engage in this sort of cyber warfare activity at at arm's length distance away from themselves. And most notably, in late 2017, there was another attack group that was identified. It's given the name APT-34 in the cybersecurity world. But the devastating part to this group is that they have been able to break into industrial control systems right across the United States. And there's really good indication that this group has been there for years, just sitting dormant, silent in this critical infrastructure environment. Biding their time for what? We don't really know. But they're there, and they were there for many, many years, and or many, many months in some cases. And they're just sitting dormant, silent, and they're collecting intelligence, and they're collecting information, and they're developing a framework to be able to deploy attacks at some point in the future. So that's what real cyber warfare looks like. Cyber warfare is full-scale, irregular warfare, akin to guerrilla warfare in a physical environment, utilizing civilians, corporations, and government and intelligence professionals the world over. The future of cyber warfare, I think, has the prospect of being some of the most devastating kind of conflict that we've seen to date. It's a kind of conflict that bankrupts nations. It's a kind of conflict that causes immense amount of pain and suffering. If you can disrupt the food supply going into a country because the ships that were bringing in food to that area, particularly landlocked or whatever logistical network is bringing food to that area, if you can disrupt those systems, then you can cause real physical harm. You can affect real physical changes through the use of cyber warfare. And I think that's something that we haven't seen on a large scale to date, but it is the kind of activity that I think we are moving closer and closer to as time moves on. So that's my presentation for the evening.
Oh, thank you. Wow. We're going to have some questions here, I'm sure. So the sound equipment is, do we need to play with that mic to change it to Omni? I don't know, but the main thing is you're going to need to repeat the questions from the audience, and we'll probably have some questions from online as well.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. You mentioned the U.S. bill that was introduced in October. Did it pass, or is it still before the House that civilians can use or can hack into other systems that aren't theirs if they suspect that they've been attacked?
So the question was whether the bill recently introduced to the House had actually passed with respect to hackback laws, if you will. This is still very much under hot debate. There are no hackback laws that have been passed, as far as I know, but it is something that the United States has been committed to developing a framework around. When I first started my career in cybersecurity way back in the 98, 99 timeframe, I attended a conference where lawyers and other legislators came together to talk about this idea of hackback in the context of a future cyber warfare type environment. So this is a discussion that's not new. It's a discussion that is ages old, and I think it's a discussion that we will have for many years into the future. I think what it's going to take is a precipitating event that is substantial and serious enough for countries to say, well, no, now we do have to come up with some framework whereby at least corporations that manage critical infrastructure can capably defend themselves. But it's a very dicey tactic in a dicey area that certainly we have no consensus opinion on today. So certainly those laws are not into effect, and we're not under the risk of those laws coming into effect anytime soon.
We have a question from from afar, talk about how Canadian networks are at risk. Can you elaborate on our local or Canadian specific problems?
So the question is how Canadian networks are necessarily at risk today. One example I can give is when I consult with organizations, one of the things that I like to do is understand the size of their IT budgets, because the size of their cybersecurity budgets are always going to be some factor of that IT budget. A good metric that I think on average most organizations around the world seem to be spending on cybersecurity is about anywhere from 3% to 6%. Here in Canada, organizations are spending, in my estimation, far less than 2.5% of their IT budgets on security. And from my perspective, it shows. I had spoken to the CEO of a company that was the victim of a cyber attack. They had some strange things happening on their computer system. They called myself and a colleague in to take a look and understand, what's going on. Is it just an IT issue? Is it a security issue? And we deployed tools and technologies to investigate. And we found that, oh no, it was a cybersecurity incident, and there was a piece of code running on a system that dumped a database with 12 million records in it, and they've had a breach. So I talked to their IT person and I said, okay, we need to respond to this, and here's what I suggest. This is what it's going to take. This is what it's going to cost. And that person looked at me and said, too expensive, and just forgot about it. So I thought, okay, let me escalate this. Let me talk to the CEO of the company. It just so happens that a friend of mine knew the CEO of this organization and was able to broker a meeting with the CEO. And I sat down and said, look, you've had 12 million records of this database breached. This is customer information that you have a duty of care to protect. And he was pretty bewildered, and he said, I wasn't even aware that this had occurred. And this was about 3 days after it had been reported. Offered free pro bono advice to them to be able to recover from the breach. They felt that they can deal with things internally. And what ended up happening was they found out that the origin of the attack was malware from a phishing attack. So somebody got this email message, somebody else clicked on a link, executed some code, and they said, oh, it's just a phishing attack. It's nothing to worry about. And I'm like, well, no, it's a phishing attack that actually resulted in the breach of 12 million customer records in your database. And they didn't put two and two together, that what they found and what we found constitutes a very significant breach. So that's just an example of the state of cybersecurity among Canadian organizations today. I mean, very few Canadian organizations, in my estimation, are taking the threat seriously enough. And I used to try not to be alarmist about this in the past, but 20 years on in my career now, I'm starting to become much more alarmist in speaking to Canadian corporations about cybersecurity. I've been to countless organizations, financial institutions, hedge funds, you name it, that are horribly compromised by nation-state actors. And we can tell they're nation-state actors. We don't know which nation-state actors they are, but the level of sophistication of the attacks that I'm responding to suggests that several hundred people were behind this, not just singular hackers working for criminal organizations.
What will they do with those 12,000 or whatever records that have been compromised? What do they want with? What are they going to do with it?
Criminals sell the information. Criminals obtain identity documents on the basis of that information that they then use to get credit cards and max out those credit cards in that person's name. They steal their identity. Nation states love to steal this kind of data en masse and hold it for a rainy day when they need to create a cover identity or persona for some future attack. And one example of this is the OPM hack in the US, where a database of information pertaining to those who have security clearances and work in sensitive areas of the US government that database was penetrated and broken into and stolen, we don't have any indication that any of that information was used for any criminal activity. And certainly the level of sophistication of that attack suggests a nation state player. So my colleagues feel that that hack is probably, the information is probably being used to for a rainy day. You know, when a cover ID is required, or when they need to co-opt an individual for some purpose, they'll sit on it and they'll use it at some later point.
Well, we have another question from London, England. What resources could cyber terrorists use to target Canadian assets? Which scenario? And how to survive these attacks?
So in the event of, I think the question was cyber terrorists, what sort of scenarios could cyber terrorists concoct in order to launch attacks against Canada? What resources do they have at their disposal, and what can we do to protect ourselves against it? So there are capabilities that I'm sure like smart individuals grouped together can accomplish some very interesting things. And I think that non-state actors developing cyber warfare capabilities can do a lot of low-level damage to a nation state for a period of time. If you're talking about knocking out an electrical grid, you might be able to do it for a period of time, but hopefully that grid is much more resilient. It'll be back up and running within a certain amount of time. It doesn't mean that you won't cause death. Could happen. We haven't seen it happen. So at the end of the day, this is one of those areas that I don't want to be too alarmist in. I don't think that individual non-state actors are going to be able to cause massive, devastating damage. It's always possible, but I don't think that's as likely as nation-state actors using their resources to conduct warfare activities. I think that is much, much more likely. Now, will it come in the form of a civilian terrorist group that is taking credit for it? Could very well happen. As I said, you know, organizations like Anonymous, in my estimation, have been co-opted for that sort of use. And how do we protect against it? Well, I think this is the responsibility of every government to develop defensive and offensive capabilities to use as a deterrence mechanism, and to capably respond to this kind of activity when it gets to the point where a response is required. You know, we're in the realm of war fighting, not causing low-level random damage and violence. And most terrorist organizations are always going to opt for the shock and awe of a gun and a bullet. But nation states, I think, are going to be more apt to use more elegant and potentially more wide-reaching and more devastating effects that could influence an entire society. So I don't think we have to worry yet from non-state actors engaging in this kind of activity on a large scale.
Here's another one from Kansas City in the U.S. How are UAVs, those drones, managed, protected in terms of their flight management software, especially military ones? You know about that?
So how are UAVs and their flight management software protected, especially U.S. military drones? So the interesting part is I had actually worked on a project for Air Canada to develop what's called e-enablement systems for aircraft technology. So I had a little bit of an introduction into the kinds of electronic systems that go onto aircraft that are connected to the neck for management and maintenance of aircraft operations. I think what's in that realm, what's probably much more likely an attack scenario is somewhere along the procurement chain of the technologies that go into the drone are compromised. Mm-hmm. You know, malicious software installed in the various different component parts of a drone. I think that is a likely scenario that would cause the U.S. government to be concerned about their fleet of drones. That's I think where these kinds of systems are more likely to be compromised. Mm-hmm. You know, so I'm not going to talk about specific attacks against these kinds of systems in the context of an aircraft, certainly this information that I don't even want to put out there. There are attacks that are possible, but I think what's more likely in the context of cyber war is that those component parts are compromised long before assembled into the final drone that then flies.
So there is a grassroots movement in the U.S. for securing their electrical infrastructure, because they say that it is quite vulnerable to attack. And something shown in the blackout of 2003. And I'm wondering if Canada has taken any steps compared to the U.S. to that, because the U.S. seems to not be, the legislators and the government seem to not be paying attention. It's just something that's growing, and they're trying to get senators involved. And I've heard about it in different sites that I've read on, but I haven't seen how that connects to Canada's protection of that infrastructure.
So the question was, there are many grassroots groups in the U.S. that are taking the security of our electrical grid quite seriously, and whether there's any sort of counterpart here in Canada, and whether the Canadian government is taking that issue seriously. From my perspective, individuals like me who work in the area of cybersecurity, whether in the government, the military, or for corporations, I think we do take the issue of cybersecurity quite seriously as practitioners. When it comes to the government and their willingness to make significant investments, I think we've seen Canada make these changes more recently. I mean, there's an initiative called the Cyber New Brunswick that has just been launched in the East Coast. And this is forming part and parcel of Canada's new national security strategy with respect to cybersecurity. And it's a consortium of public and private organizations, universities, that are trying to develop tools and technologies to address the issues of the vulnerability of our electrical grid and these industrial control systems. So there's quite a significant amount of investment that Canada has finally put into the development of a leading center of excellence to deal with that problem and tackle it and figure out how we can solve it. So I think I've been very encouraged to see that from a defensive perspective. My concern is that the Canadian government seems to, for many years across different administrations, we seem to have this idea that developing the offensive capabilities is somehow un-Canadian of us to do so. And so where I worry is not so much on the development of defensive capabilities, but I'm very worried about our country's lack of ability in fully engaging in offensive capabilities. If our nation does not have freedom of action in cyberspace, then that puts us as civilians in Canada at risk, in my opinion. So that's where I'm much more concerned. Oh, I think there's a question.
Hi, yeah. You've talked a lot about nation-state actors, not so much about multinational corporations and the role of this kind of cyber warfare and, for example, industrial espionage in the private sector. I just wonder how much of your presentation applies in that context and what the implications are.
So the question was, the presentation focused a lot about nation-state attacks, but not so much on industrial espionage type examples. Certainly, there are. I work for an organization that is a boutique private security firm in Toronto, and we deal with the issue of industrial espionage on a fairly regular basis. We're working with organizations to develop counterintelligence programs such that these types of industrial espionage activities they become more resilient to those kinds of attacks. You do have examples from time to time where corporations are so competitive with each other that they'd like to steal their information and hire nefarious criminals and individuals to break into their systems and gather information using a lot of the tools and techniques and processes that I talked about. So all of that still applies. It does happen, but I wouldn't say that it's a rare occurrence, but much of industrial espionage, I think, also is pushed forward by different nation states. In the realm of aerospace, you have different countries that have tried to develop technologies to dominate in the dimension of air in their warfighting capabilities. And what that necessarily means is co-opting their leading organizations in that industry to gather the best possible information that can be used for developing warfighting capabilities. So we have examples where nation states have actually broken into Canadian companies to steal technology and share it with the corporations in a foreign country so that they can better compete against us in that same market, or that they can gain technology that doesn't exist outside of the Canadian technology market. That's where I see much more examples of espionage, like the incestuous nature of this world of war-fighting, cyber warfare, criminal organizations, and civilians is basically what it all looks like. I mean, just because there is activity at a low level that seemingly is just industrial espionage, 9 times out of 10 it still tracks back to developing something that's in the interest of a nation state. So, once again, I would say that it's a complex spider's web of connection.
Here's another follow-on, in a way, from on that. Another question from a remote audience asking about Canada's capacity for and arsenal for cyber retaliation, and what is Canada's foreign policy, so to speak, regarding North Korean hackers who mostly are operating outside their own country. What do we have a position on what to do with these guys?
So the question was our capabilities to actually engage in this sort of cyber warfare capability, and specifically what our nation's policy is with respect to North Korean cyber attacks. I think you would have to ask a government official for the government's official position on North Korea and their hacking capabilities. I know our Prime Minister has taken a different approach to try to broker peace between North Korea and getting involved in talks between North Korea and the US and South Korea. So I think that further indicates that we're following along the line of soft diplomacy rather than the use of hard power. That said, I can guarantee that organizations like the Communications Security Establishment are taking very seriously the job of developing these kinds of defensive and offensive capabilities and weapons to defend against a potential North Korean strike. I'm not aware of any specific policy on North Korea, however, but I would venture to say that the track that we're on is still on the diplomatic track, as opposed to actually developing a real warfighting capability in Canada. I'd like to see that because I know how devastating it can be not having that capability. I'd like to see our country do much more in developing that kind of cyber warfighting capability. I think it was a question up here.
Hi, thanks very much for a great presentation. Could you talk about cryptocurrencies, your thoughts on national security implications thereof? And are you advising any government bodies? And if you were, what would you say? And finally, how can nations balance how the quick capitalization of innovation can happen through things like ICOs with security needs?
That's a loaded question. So on the topic of cryptocurrencies and how that sort of fits into the mix and and my knowledge of initial coin offerings and how that necessarily impacts what we've been talking about this evening. I'm not a cryptocurrency expert. It's not something that I particularly specialize in. There are a couple of interesting observations, however, that I think we can all make with respect to cryptocurrency and nation-state involvement and these sorts of things. China has developed, massive cryptocurrency mining farms for many, many years, and now suddenly they decided to pull out. And I think that's largely consistent with the way that China has engaged in the world. China has done a lot to engage in economic warfare type activities with other nation states. And I see that the pullout of the cryptocurrencies is perhaps much to do of the same kind of activity. They've benefited from it. They have developed it to a certain point. They have significant influence in that domain, and now they're suddenly pulling out. I question why that's happening. We do know that China has also tried to come up with their own version of cryptocurrency. There's even lots of speculation that they want to create a cryptocurrency that somehow is backed by the special drawing right, the SDR, which China would like to see replace the US dollar as a world reserve currency. I think we have to wait and see what happens. However, it's too early to tell how cryptocurrencies are necessarily going to influence and affect our future, and whether they're going to play a long-lasting part of our global economy or not. Certainly, every nation state on the world has a vested interest in developing capabilities in this domain. From a warfighting perspective, it's part of developing economic warfare capabilities. I think we've seen China dominate this space, and we should be weary and careful about their attempts to do so.
I like your interpretation of Snowden's actions. Maybe you could summarize, if you don't want to say anything personally, maybe just summarize what is in the public domain or in publications about what because you would have some elaboration on the technologies and also the security threats that represent.
So the question was my personal opinions on the Snowden affair, and that is one dicey area for anybody to comment on. And I would I don't have enough knowledge of specifically what happened with the whole Snowden information, the Snowden affair, to have any real opinions on it. The one thing that I think I can safely say, however, is that contrary to the public narrative in the media and the press, that there were no significant ramifications from the exposure of the information that Snowden was responsible for putting out there. From my perspective, I have seen a lot of damage done. I have seen an entire capability set that had to be redeveloped as a result of Snowden's actions. So I'm not so positive on the long-term effects and outcomes of what had happened. Now, at the same time, the fact that we had a huge public discourse on the use of surveillance technologies and how those technologies should be appropriately used by nation states, I think, is an important conversation to have. It's a conversation that was long overdue. It's a conversation that we did have as a result of the Snowden incident. And that's certainly one positive thing that came from that. Here in the Canadian context, in Canada's use of surveillance technologies, and from my perspective, there's a huge amount of checks and balances that exist in the use of this kind of technology here in Canada that I didn't necessarily see with other nation states around the world. The United States, I think, did have to take a serious look at the checks and balances that they had in place with their surveillance programs and systems. And I'm glad that at least that was something that, that had been addressed to some extent. But at the end of the day, nation states like the US and Canada are faced with adversaries the world over that are quickly developing devastating cyber weapons and capabilities. So at the end of the day, these nation states have to do what they need to do to develop that deterrence capability set. So has that stopped? Has Snowden stopped the development of cyber weapons in the US or stopped the development of surveillance tools and technologies? Absolutely not. And neither should those programs be stopped. I think they can be better managed. There can be better checks and balances. But if the effect was to stop these programs, I don't think that there was even a blip in the stopping from pursuing those technologies in the U.S.
I have two questions. One is my own, and that is that a year ago we had at this podium a speaker who, Paul Meyer, who was former disarmament ambassador, who's very concerned about cybersecurity and cyber warfare. And he spoke more not about deterrence, the use of cyber warfare capability as a deterrent, but rather about regulation, international laws, treaties, etc. And he spoke of a group of governmental experts who had been impaneled by the UN, I believe, and asked to come up with recommendations for something equivalent to, or maybe really called, a treaty that would regulate and prohibit the kinds of things that you have been advocating. Would you like to comment on that alternative to your own perspective?
Well, I can't comment on that initiative in particular because I don't know enough about that initiative. But one example of nations coming together to establish policies, rules, regulations, standards for the kinds of technologies that are dual use, that could be used for good or could be used for evil, especially used for conducting surveillance activities. The EU had established a treaty that did tackle this topic of cyber war, and the way that they did that is outlawing the development of tools and technologies that are specifically used for infiltrating computer systems, break and enter tools in the cyberspace, if you will. Here's the effect of that. As a cybersecurity professional that's tasked with working with corporations and defending some very important infrastructure, sometimes critical infrastructure, I need to develop devastating cyber attack tools in order to do my job. And to some extent, there are colleagues of mine in the EU that are now taking a serious look at the work that they do in researching cyber warfare and researching the development of exploits, and whether they can actually continue to do that on European soil or not. Canada has not fully ratified that treaty, so we don't have any impending laws or regulations that outlaw the development of exploit code here in Canada per se. There's probably some law or legislation that might govern it from the perspective of copyright laws and copyright infringement and reverse engineering. But this is just an example of how difficult it is to develop legislation that strikes the right balance in this area of cybersecurity. Just as much as these technologies can be used for evil, they're also used by people like me to do good. And if we're impeded by that because of legislation, well, that also puts our nation state at a disadvantage, because those organizations that engage in this kind of activity will go elsewhere, and we will be bereft of that skill and talent here in Canada. So.
Okay, here's somebody who, from a distance, talks about something that was in the United States government, an agency called the Federal Investigative Services Division, which was within the U.S. Office of Personnel Management and was responsible for performing security clearance investigations. He wonders whether or not there's anything equivalent to that in Canada.
The question was whether the full structure of the OPM organization in the U.S. has its counterpart here in Canada. It's not something that I have any specific knowledge about.
Okay. There's another one. Go ahead. Go ahead with somebody here.
There's a question up in the galley.
You spoke about defense, response, and offense. And obviously, when you have a bad situation, response and offense have to deal with near-term goals. But as a generalization of the electrical question earlier, are there efforts, are you aware of any efforts at all? Well, whether for infrastructure, and we're talking about from PC upward, right, to improve the security of the underlying infrastructure, and also on the political side, such as changing public opinion through disinformation campaigns and whatnot, efforts to educate a citizenry as a whole, anywhere in the world, not necessarily in Canada. I imagine it's a lot less expensive to develop defensive response and offensive capabilities than to re-educate an entire nation. But the others see the techniques that are discussed today seem reactive when the underlying problem, weak infrastructure at all levels, right, from everything after the power cord, and poorly integrated citizenry in terms of conversations and critical reasoning skills and so on.
So, question of disinformation campaigns and that with respect to cyber offensive capabilities development being more reactive as opposed to proactive. Influence operations in the Canadian military context is referred to as military influence operations, or MIO. And there are different kinds of MIO activities that would necessarily be engaged in. Some of it is combat oriented, some of it is intelligence oriented, and other areas fall into the realm of marketing, let's say. So if we are operating in a country like Afghanistan and we are trying to participate in the rebuild efforts, there's also the ability to use influence operations to change the mindset, the perspectives, and views, the opinions of that group of citizens in that country to participate in the efforts of rebuilding their nation state. So in talking about more proactive, positive uses of influence operations, certainly the military also operates in the context of developing capabilities to change the thinking of populace people to participate or act in some positive way. And the prime example of that is rebuild efforts in Afghanistan. We have what's called civic troops that are out there in the field who are interacting with individuals in local neighborhoods and developing one-on-one relationships with them with the objective of working with that populace to improve the local security situation, the safety situation, to participate in rebuild efforts, to maybe pave the way for humanitarian organizations to be able to safely maneuver and operate in that area. And all of that still also falls into the area of military influence operations. So, I focus very much on the dark side this evening of what influence operations is all about. But certainly there are very proactive, very positive effects that can also be achieved through the use of the same kinds of techniques.
Here's another question from the UK, which refers to how victims of cyber crimes sometimes are mistakenly believed to be victims, that this is a victimless crime. Cyber criminals are actually causing a lot of personal distress and emotional trauma, as well as financial ruin to some people, civilians and so on. Are there any institutions or nonprofit organizations that you know of that address the needs of victims, especially here in Canada?
So are there any NGOs that deal with the needs of the victims of cybercrime? I couldn't point to any one particular organization that is doing a lot of work, but I would imagine that the prevalence of identity theft has probably given rise to a whole new area of study with respect to human psychology and recouping from those kinds of traumatic incidents that certainly can detract the level of trust that individuals have in the use of these systems and technologies that are just so pervasive in our life. So that's to the extent to which I can necessarily comment on that. The comment, however, on cybercrime being a victimless crime, I think the only reason why we have this perception a little bit that cyber criminals or cybercrime is victimless is because we have insurance organizations that up until now have largely paid out policies that cover this sort of activity. But I think that's also changing in the realm of corporations today that purchase cybersecurity policy insurance to protect themselves against attack. Up until this point, organizations that have cyber policy insurance that have been victims of cyber attack have largely been covered by the insurance companies, even if they were negligent to some extent in taking care of security and adopting good hygiene. But I see that as changing. Certainly that has changed in the US. It certainly has changed in other countries around the world where insurance companies now have better data to understand what the real costs of cybercrime are. And as a result, they're putting more of an onus on corporations to do their part in developing good hygiene to prevent an attack. We haven't seen that very much here in Canada. I think we are seeing insurance companies push that perspective from 2018 onwards. And I hope that becomes a greater trend because I think that organizations in Canada need to take their duty of care much more seriously with respect to issues of cybersecurity.
How deeply integrated are you in terms of understanding foreign policy, defense, and international relations? Because the context is much broader than technical. And wouldn't you have to know a country's intentions and their interactions and their histories in order to know what you're looking for, technically? So do you interact with these professionals? Where, when, and in what contexts?
So absolutely. I mean, I'm a technical expert that's sort of providing commentary on the area of geopolitics and hacking and all this sort of activity. So I'll have a very different perspective than somebody who is a geopolitical scientist might necessarily have. I have a practitioner's point of view as opposed to an academic point of view on the subject matter. The organization that I work for also has a geopolitical risk practice headed by an individual by the name of Charles Dumbrill, who is an intelligence analyst who spent many years working in the domain of international affairs, who has done a lot of work in the area of geopolitical analysis on a wide-ranging set of security issues that corporations are faced with that are operating in hostile foreign countries. So certainly we do engage with individuals like that on a fairly regular basis, especially if we're working on a project that demands a very different perspective. Some of the work that I do is called red teaming work. And what we do is take a very adversarial approach to looking at a specific problem. We'll look at a problem from the perspective of a devil's advocate analysis. So in order to do that, we need to have a lot of competing perspectives and competing points of view. These are activities that are done in a multidisciplinary setting. So you don't just simply have technical experts, you've got legal experts, you have politicians, political experts, what have you. And we sit around the table to brainstorm through a problem set. And the objective there is to really wrestle with competing points of view until we have a clear understanding of the dynamic involved in the problem that we're trying to address. So certainly that is very much a part of my everyday job and activities.
From your end, can you confirm that Russia's involvement into Canadian politics or possibly elections, indeed? Why I'm asking because a couple of months ago at the Defense Committee in the Canadian Parliament, this question was raised, and I guess there is some trend to boost the defense budget because of this so-called Russian involvement. So I just want to know if you have encountered anything like that so far.
So the question was Russia's involvement in cyber warfare type activities against Canadian interests. I don't have any specific knowledge of any specific campaign of Russia to co-opt our free and democratic elections. Certainly, it would be a concern, however, that those tasked with protecting our election system should think seriously about any nation state that might wish to conduct that kind of activity. I don't have any ability to say that Russia has been involved in meddling with our democratic systems in the way that it's alleged to have done in the context of the last US election. I hope that we never do see any sort of activities that even come close to mimicking the kinds of activities that we had seen with the last US election. But I am confident that there are people that are diligently working behind the scenes to make sure that doesn't happen.
By the way, on that, I have a lot of friends in Russia, and those who are most concerned about and very enthusiastic about democracy and who don't like Putin, nevertheless are united in believing that the whole claim about Russia's success in influencing the U.S. elections is overblown, and they simply don't believe a word of it. They argue very strongly that couldn't have happened. I'd like your opinion about whether or not they could conceivably have had a real effect on the outcome of the U.S. election.
With respect to Russia's activities in the U.S. and the last election, I think it's incredibly difficult to say what Russia had or had not done. The first time that we had a view into what Russia might have done is in the example that I provided with the Internet Research Agency, where Facebook had attributed certain transactions to that organization having procured ads and run political campaign ads across the U.S. So aside, and even then, I mean, we haven't seen the public proof and evidence that supports this claim that the Internet Research Agency was necessarily behind that. This is analysis that have happened behind closed doors, so the public doesn't have the benefit of seeing that. And I would argue in some cases that there is something to be said for the public not having a complete view on what the government necessarily knows about Russia or any other foreign government's activities here in Canada, because we don't necessarily want to reveal how we obtain that information. Perhaps it was the development of our own surveillance tools and technologies, or counterintelligence programs that we have in place. And there's a need to protect the privacy of those programs just the same. So, as much as I would love to find out, well, what is the clear evidence that people are using to suggest that Russia had engaged in these activities, I'd love to see it. I would love to dig into that data just as a technologist, but I don't know if I or anybody else will ever necessarily get to see that information. But I think it's quite certain that every developed nation state on the planet is engaging in this form of activity in one way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. Any nation state that relies upon the development of new technology that's key and critical to their economy are going to develop or look to developing defensive capabilities, responsive capabilities, and offensive capabilities to protect their interests.
One more question? No. All right.
No.
Then we're through.
Thank you very much for your time this evening.